So I'll just start talking while you guys are finding your way back to your seats. My name's Jodi Hoffman. I'm a member of the Utah Land Use Institute Board. This has been a fun panel for me to work with. It's interesting, some of the feedback that I've received in the last couple of weeks is, gee, it's really nice for you guys to talk about water, you know, and to integrate water and land use planning. And it's like, well, I can tell you that we have been, from the municipal side, for a very long time. We may not be cross-pollinating enough with the scientists and the engineers, but certainly it's been an obsession, especially on the Wasatch Back and in Washington County. We've just been absolutely fixated because on the Wasatch Back, maybe unlike on the Wasatch Front to date, on the Wasatch Back, development doesn't happen without water. You have to identify your water source. You have to bring it in before the development gets approved. And I see that coming, frankly, for the Wasatch Front. And they'll need some assistance from the conservancy districts because up here until now, the conservancy districts have been, hey, you need it, we're going to supply it. You've got a need, we've got a source. We don't really have that kind of philosophy on the Wasatch Back, and certainly not so much yet in the South. So our panel today is, you can look at the advertisement for it, it's a little bit of a mishmash, right? It's you think, oh, how are we going to weave all of this stuff together into a nice fabric? Well, we'll see. We're going to see. Couple of things have happened in the I served on the Governor Herbert's water task force. I think it was 2015, 16, 17. And I can tell you that the dialogue's changed pretty dramatically since then. Because there's two words that could not be spoken, could not utter the two words just 6 or 7 years ago. And that was climate change. Couldn't say those things. And now I see it spoken pretty freely by the conservancy districts, by all sorts of folks. That's a step in a good direction, frankly. Because what does it do? It brings to kind of a crystallized realization that there are forces in nature that we don't control, that we've only got a 2-year supply in our reservoirs for water consumption. Like it or not, if we don't get snowfall, we don't have water. And it also makes us realize how interdependent we all are with one another. So the other thing that happened in the last couple of years is we've had this constant reseeding of the shoreline of the Great Salt Lake. And that has led to, not just what are all the waterfowl going to do, which is the national migration pattern for the entire migratory bird system, but it's also led to the exposure of some pretty dangerous chemicals in the soil, in the lake bed, and just a realization finally that we've got to address this issue. Now, the legislature is coming at it kind of the way you might expect the legislature to come at it, which is as a predominantly developer-oriented body. Which is great. So for the last several decades that I've been involved in this, the focus has always been on that 15% of water in 100% of the system, that 15% of water that's been committed to the M&I system. And 6, 7 years ago with the Governor's Water Task Force, that's all we talked about. And the elephant in the room was that 85%, the gentleman over here. We're going to continue to talk about that 15% for a while in this panel because we're dealing with the legislature that we've been given. Last year, the legislature passed a number of bills that we're going to talk about at this panel. and talk to you about what you can do in your municipalities or for your development entity to address the new legislation. So our panel is my friend Shawn Guzman, who I've known forever, pretty much forever. He was the city attorney for St. George, where and it was assigned to the legislature every year, and so we spent a lot of time talking about the issues in St. George and the Washington County. And now he's taken a really good move from a career development standpoint, and he's stepped away from the city attorney job, and he's now the government relations director, government affairs director. And he's going to tell you about all the things that you need to look into to address from a legislative mandate point of view in order to address your water supply issues in your jurisdiction. The next panelist is Laura Vernon, and I kept Laura is the Great Salt Lake coordinator of the Utah Department of Natural Resources, and she's been dealing with issues with the Great Salt Lake for 15 years. And I talked to Laura, and I said, I know you for someplace. Well, she's also currently chairman of the Planning Commission of South Salt Lake City, one of my clients. It's like shoes. Oops. And she's going to tell you all the things that she's working on to address the kind of the hard, cold reality of the challenges that we're facing now with the Great Salt Lake. And then after that, we have Rob Patterson, who's another land use attorney who works for lots of different small municipal jurisdictions, including the town or city? City, because you're over 1,000 people, right? Yeah. Of Oakley, who has placed a halt on development in Oakley as a result of a lack of water supply. We're going to talk about that. And then, excuse me as I fumble through my notes. So then we have Dr. Joanna Endter-Wada, who is a professor of natural resource policy and social science at the Quinney College of Natural Resources at Utah State University. Her research focuses on water policy, urban landscape, water use and conservation, and the human dimensions of drought and climate change. All right, someone's talking about it. That's good. I've spent, I think, at least 2 hours on the phone last week with Dr. Endter-Wada. She's fascinating. You're going to really enjoy her speech. We're going to start off this hour and a half with Shawn Guzman. Save your questions. We will give you time to ask questions and have your questions answered at the end of our session. Shawn, take it away.
Thank you, Jodi. I know that in Salt Lake, looking at the room, you want to make sure you leave early. You want to get on the road. Yesterday, I was in St. George and a meeting went late, and it took me about 8 minutes to get home, and so I was frustrated. So I understand. So I will not go long because I know you guys probably have 10 minutes to get home. A couple of things I wanted to hit on. A lot of things I wanted to talk on have already been discussed today. And so you've heard about a lot of the innovations that we're doing, some of the legislation that came about last year. But I will say this, that last year we saw more water bills that were not related to water rights than we've ever seen. And it was fun, but it was kind of difficult to keep on top of everything because sometimes there are competing bills. Just to get I know I came a little late, had to come up from St. George, but I know you probably raised your hands, but how many here are from cities and counties from local government or represent local government? Okay, so how many here are from commercial developers, maybe represent commercial developers, and how many are home builders? I shouldn't say just home builders because you're very important. Well, and I want to hit on this topic here because we're about evenly split here. That shows that we are in this together when it comes to water. In St. George, which by the way is bigger than Ogden now, which surprises a lot of people here, and if our growth trajectory keeps up, because some of the larger cities up here like Provo and Orem and Sandy are landlocked, we're on a trajectory to pass them up too. So we're growing quickly and we're very dynamic, but we couldn't do it without the development community. There is a large segment of our population that is reliant on the development community. And one other myth that we have, I don't know if it applies up here on the Wasatch Front, so maybe some of the panelists can say this, but our data shows in Washington County that the biggest driver of growth is internal. You know, there's that myth that it's all Californians moving in, why should I save water just so that someone else can move in and take our water? But I just look at my family. I have 5 children when we moved to St. George. Well, I still have 5 children when you think of it after we moved to St. George. So, but 3 of them are married now. 2 of them married people from outside of the state who have relocated to St. George to be married to someone from there. And now they're starting to have children who will also want a place to live. And none of them that want to buy a house can afford a house right now. It's difficult for them to do that. And so as a parent, I want them to stay. I assume that's the same on the Wasatch Front. So working together, we need to work together with the development community. And so collaboration is key, not just with cities and counties working together with their conservancy districts or their wholesale water suppliers, but also working with the development community too, and the realtors, and going to the state legislature and giving input. And I think this last session, I can say that one bill I'll bring up in particular that I think demonstrated what we could do was House Bill 282. That was Representative Wilcox's water-wise landscaping bill. I believe it was Representative Ward that had another bill that progressed pretty far along during the session that also had to do with landscaping. We looked at the original draft of the bill, looking at the diverse areas of the state. I understand we're down the southwest corner. I still have people that will say, look, why don't we have a meeting in southern Utah? We will hold it in Moab, and everybody in Wasatch Front want to go. And I'll say, I can get to Los Angeles quicker than I can to Moab from St. George. There's still a kind of a learning curve sometimes with this. We saw the bill, and there were several parts of this bill that really caused us some big concern. For example, if you go to a Costco up here, you're fighting, especially in the summertime, you're fighting for a parking space, right? In St. George, we fight over the shade from a light pole in the parking lot so that we can park our cars. It's hot, right? And it's a heat sink. Think of all of our trees in downtown St. George, and the mature trees. A lot of them survive because we had those old irrigation ditch running along the streets, and so now we're having to come up with other ways to make sure they get their water and still keep that canopy, because it provides shade, it lowers the temperature, it helps in so many different ways environmentally. The original bill that was proposed said that you could only plant plants that could survive at maturity with minimal watering. And of course, that would mean no trees in St. George. In fact, most of our vegetation would be gone. And so we raised the alarm bell and said, it might work for some of the other areas of the state, but that won't work for us. We need that. We need that for environmentally, to have cooler climate zones around our homes and in our streets and our parking lots, but also for the ambiance of the community. But we think we can do it and still conserve water. So we met with Representative Wilcox. It was great to sit down with us and discuss it. And we made some major changes to the bill that I still think works. I would ask those cities and counties that are here, how many of you have passed a water-wise landscaping ordinance already? So this is why I wanted to hit this topic, because there's still plenty of work to do out there in our jurisdictions to pass an ordinance that is in compliance with state law. And I think the law that we came up with has general enough language to apply throughout the state and give us some flexibility, but it's also specific enough that it requires us to take some action as local jurisdictions. I did catch Zach Renstrom, our Conservancy District, I guess his title would be Director. I guess I should ask Craig Call because he would know that, but I should know his title. But we work closely with Zach and with Ron Thompson before that as the City of St. George to come up with a system to conserve as much water as we can. In fact, if you look at our growth rate trajectory, what we've grown, the curve is a lot steeper than the curve for our culinary water usage. And that's happened through a combination of things. One, in the summertime, we've adopted conservation rules for probably 15 to 20 years now, and raised the rates a little bit to try to get people to conserve water. But by and large, people have done it naturally by landscaping more carefully. But we looked at this as an opportunity to get something in place statewide with this, working with Representative Wilcox. We didn't oppose it. We just wanted to make sure it could fit throughout the state. But Zach said a couple things, and I grabbed him and I said, I guess you were just like maybe Mr. Brady, and I mean for the Brady Bunch, not Tom Brady's dad. But where you have to sit down all your kids and say, well, I'm not going to pick out the ones that weren't being good. I'm just going to tell you all from now on, you guys, need to be home by 11 o'clock. Because as a City of St. George, we actually went to the district 2 years ago and said, we want to adopt a landscape ordinance, but we want it to be uniform throughout the district because we all use district water wholesale. And if we do it and no one else does, then it's not going to be uniform and we won't get the savings we want. We also went to Zach and said, we want a will serve letter. And he said, what's that? So we explained to him what a will serve letter was. And so I told him, I said, I'm just going to gently correct on the record that St. George was not one of those. We were actually coming to you on those issues and saying, let's do this all together. And that's what I wanted to hit on. One, look at this water-wise landscaping statute, all the local jurisdictions, and developers. Because if you are developing in jurisdictions that have not adopted one, you should know what the statute says, but also encourage whatever jurisdictions you're in to adopt ordinances that follow the HB 282. And also, we need to, as we do this together, working together, we need to draw in anyone who has some concerns on how to proceed, on whether or not we are doing what we need to do, whether we are complying with the secondary water ordinances as far statutes as far as putting in meters, but also anything that has to do with landscaping or water use in general. If we collaborate together with the development community, with the League of Cities and Towns, with UAC when that's appropriate, and the legislature, I think we could, even though it's a small segment, I agree with Jodi, a small segment of the water that we're trying to wring more water out of, we can do it. It's probably the most costly segment of water that we can develop right now, but it's something that we could easily do. So collaboration between the water conservancy districts, the development community, the local jurisdictions, and the legislature is key. And with that, I'm just going to pass along to the rest of the panel and then leave time for questions and answers.
Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, can you hear me all right? Thumbs up? All right. Thank you guys for having me here today. My name is Vernon. I'm the Great Salt Lake Coordinator for the Utah Department of Natural Resources, and I'm thrilled to be in this room. And when I received an invitation from Bart to present here today, it kind of took my breath away because for the past couple of years, we've been wringing our hands about how to save Great Salt Lake, and we're like, what are the groups that we need to start talking to help them understand why the lake is so important, and it's important in their work. It's important to me. We're all connected, we're all affected, and this is the very group that I was like, we need to get in front of realtors, developers, cities and counties, and help them understand that the decisions that they make impact the Great Salt Lake. So thrilled to be here. I just want to talk a little bit about the importance of Great Salt Lake. People are talking about how this last year in the legislative session was the year of water, but I like to think it was the year of Great Salt Lake because it got so much attention. Perhaps you heard. Anyway, I'm going to start off with a quick question. How many of you, by show of hands, like anything that you see up on the screen? Raise of hands. Anybody? All right. Well, then you, whether you know it or not, are directly connected to Great Salt Lake. So if you enjoy shrimp cocktail at a restaurant, say here in Utah, in New York, in San Francisco, the chances are pretty likely that your shrimp ate brine shrimp from the Great Salt Lake. So 43% of the world's brine shrimp comes from Great Salt Lake, and it goes to feed baby shrimp and baby fish and aquaculture facilities around the world. So again, never look at a shrimp again without thinking of baby brine shrimp in Great Salt Lake. If you enjoy a beverage in a cold beverage in an aluminum can, then you are directly connected to Great Salt Lake, because the magnesium that's in those cans, along with the aluminum, most likely comes from Great Salt Lake. U.S. Magnesium produces 14% of the world's supply of magnesium, but the lion's share of the magnesium in the United States. And that goes for things like stadium benches, car seats, steering wheels, all sorts of parts where magnesium is key to add to metal products. And then again, if you enjoy a good trail mix when you're hiking out on a trail from time to time, you have a direct connection to the Great Salt Lake because of the sulfate of potash that is harvested from Great Salt Lake, that is placed on high-end nuts and fruits like almonds and cashews and apricots and peaches, and all of those items that go into your trail mix are fertilized with sulfate of potash from Great Salt Lake. I would assume that you also appreciate speaking on your cell phones and maybe have an electric car that has a lithium-ion battery. We have several companies right now that are working on producing lithium from the Great Salt Lake. And so as the demand for these products increases, the importance of keeping it local and producing these things here in Utah becomes more and more important. So what are the Great Salt Lake elevations? I'm sure you've all heard that the Great Salt Lake hit a historic low this year. We're setting records every day. But we've been measuring the Great Salt Lake elevation since 1847. And today, like I said, we are at the lowest of lows of measured recorded history at 4188.8. And I think we're going to settle out here for the remainder of the year. As Shelby mentioned earlier, the maximum was about 4212, and that was set back in 1986. We've plummeted, not just a steady decline, well, a pretty sharp decline in the last 25 plus years to get down to this historic low where we are right now. The previous historic low was set last year, and we are almost 2.5 feet lower than we were this time last year. So where does water from the Great Salt Lake come from? It comes primarily from the Bear River. So 47% of the water that flows into Great Salt Lake is from the Bear River, 27% from the Jordan, and 18% from the Weber. There is some small contributions from the West Desert, but pretty negligible. We have the historic average is about 2 million acre feet a year that makes its way to Great Salt Lake. But you can see this is just an example of the last 2 years, but trends have been similar over the last 5 years. That this year we had a little bit better than last year at 779,000 acre feet of water making it to Great Salt Lake. So less than half of the water that we need to keep Great Salt Lake levels sustainable is reaching the lake. So we keep finding ourselves in a hole that we can't quite get out of. In past times, we like to see the lake come up about 2.5 feet every year. This year was just over a foot, and the year before that was just under a foot. So again, we're just not making those gains that we need to. So we don't need just one good year to bring lake levels back up. We need, I don't know, it's depressing to think, but I mean, we could use 5 to 10 years to just kind of stabilize things, get things back up to where we'd all like them to be. So I hinted at why the Great Salt Lake is important when talking about food and minerals and industry, and I could spend a whole session just talking about the importance of Great Salt Lake, but I just wanted to touch on the brine shrimp again. Not only is it important for the brine shrimp industry, but the brine shrimp are the food source for millions of migratory birds that fly past Great Salt Lake each year. I'll talk about that in just a minute. Again, critical flyway for these over 330 bird species that depend on Great Salt Lake. We have a recreation industry that's, well, it's hurting right now because there are no operating marinas on Great Salt Lake, and so we are looking at dredging some of the marinas in order to, not just for recreation, but just for search and rescue purposes, and I can talk a bit about that in a minute. And then, of course, industry is a pretty big economic driver to the state, and so as lake levels recede, it becomes harder and harder for these companies to pull the water from the lake and move around in their evaporation ponds. So like I said, from an ecological standpoint, the Great Salt Lake can't be the importance of the Great Salt Lake can't be overstated. The birds, 10 million of them, that fly past here each year depend on Great Salt Lake. And as terminal saline lakes around the west are drying up, Mono Lake, Owens Lake, Salton Sea, Great Salt Lake is kind of like the last stop, right? It's the one-stop shop for these birds, and they depend on the habitat here. They come and they eat a bunch of brine shrimp and brine flies, and they rest and they nest and they gear up for their journey. And because there are fewer of the other lakes around, so this Great Salt Lake becomes even more and more important to these birds. And they also depend on the wetlands around Great Salt Lake, and we're talking about Washington County in southern Utah, super dry. Well, 80% of the wetlands in the entire state are found around Great Salt Lake. And so again, super dependent. Some of the waterfowl birds depend on that unique habitat as they're migrating. We now know a little bit more about these microbialite structures. It's kind of like the coral reef of the Great Salt Lake. And this is, we're learning more and more every day, but it's the food source for the brine shrimp and the brine flies that the birds eat. And they're, because the lake levels are so low, the microbialites are exposed. And so the brine shrimp and the brine flies don't have enough food to eat, so there's gonna be less food for the birds. So, but talking about the economic benefits of the lake, why the lake is important from an economic perspective, we have about $1.3 billion annually that is derived from the Great Salt Lake. That comes primarily from the mineral extraction industry. We also have, like I said, aquaculture industry and recreation. And we have about 7,700 jobs that are a result of the activities on Great Salt Lake. So why would all these benefits dry up? Well, it's kind of why I'm here talking to you today while many of the panel members are, because the climate is changing, right? We're in a sustained drought. And Shelby showed this image too, but I just wanted to highlight the point that we are in a mega drought. So the Great Salt Lake is drying up for two reasons. One is because that hole that I talked about, the runoff isn't adequate to help us raise lake levels. And that's because the air temperature is warmer and the precipitation is less. So we need cooler temperatures and more water to fill Great Salt Lake back up. But right now we're in this drought and we need to figure out how to do more with less. I said there's two reasons. The other reason that Great Salt Lake is at historic low lake levels is because of us. So we're here, we're part of the problem. A study done by USU in 2016 said that the Great Salt Lake is 11 feet lower than it would be if humans weren't here. So humans are causing, or the 11-foot reduction in Great Salt Lake is a result of humans and the uses that happen upstream. So just really quickly, this talks about depletions. Mark was kind of getting at earlier. We have total depletions at the top. The blue line in the middle is agriculture use. in the Great Salt Lake watershed, there's about 70% of the water used in the watershed comes from agricultural use. And these other uses are much less. You can see where they're holding water in the reservoirs. Municipal industrial is pretty flat. You can see we've talked about the population increasing, and there's more and more townhomes and more high-density developments, less large lot subdivisions, but the municipal and industrial use has remained relatively low. I think that's rather interesting. And then wetlands, and then recent attention has been placed on the mineral extraction industries on Great Salt Lake. How could they possibly keep extracting water when the lake levels are decreasing? But you can see here that their overall water use is relatively low in comparison to some of the other uses. So we know the benefits could dry up because of climate change and human depletion, but what are the costs of that? We know what the benefits are of Great Salt Lake, but what are the costs? So we know that we could see substantial costs on the magnitude of millions and billions of dollars if the lake level continues to drop. That could be because of increased dust, reduced lake access. Like I said, the mineral operators can't get their boats out. The brine shrimp mineral operators can't get their brine out. Brine shrimp operators can't get their boats out. We could have reduced lake effect snow. You all enjoy skiing. You have about 5 to 8% of the snow annually comes from lake effect snow from the Great Salt Lake. It's not that much, but in a mega drought, we need all the water we can get, right? And so if we do have less snow from lake effect snow, we'll have shorter ski seasons. Increased salinity, again, that could lead to decreases in the brine shrimp population, which decreases the revenue from the brine shrimp industry. Other costs could come from habitat loss, island bridges where you have increased predation, and then increased Phragmites coverage, which is a non-native species that's really difficult to eradicate and uses a ton of water. So, like I mentioned, we know that the cost could be pretty substantial. So about 1.7 to over $2 billion annually could be a result of a drying Great Salt Lake. And of course, this is in an order of magnitude, depending on how low the lake goes, would depend on what the costs are. But I think the most remarkable thing here, I mean, you can look and see where the impacts would be, but the most remarkable piece is the mitigation costs. So how do we mitigate the impacts of the exposed lake bed? And I'll talk about that in a minute. Great Salt Lake Advisory Council commissioned a study in 2019 that looked at consequences of drying lakes around the world. We looked at 8 different terminal saline lakes, RLC in Uzbekistan. We looked at the drying lake Urmia in Iran. But we didn't have to look very far to see what the impacts were of drying terminal lakes and how adverse it is for local communities. This is a picture of Owens Lake, which is in Southern California, just above LA, the city of Los Angeles. And in 1900, it resembled Great Salt Lake with a couple exceptions. It was a little less salty and a lot smaller. But anyway, as LA started developing, they started taking all of that water for large single lot developments and strip malls and all sorts of things. And by 2016, they were experiencing some pretty significant dust storms. And they didn't begin in 2016. They began in the mid-1980s. And in the mid-1980s, Owens Lake, or Inyo County, was the largest source of particulate pollution in the United States. So the EPA jumped in and said, hey, you guys need to fix your dust problem. This is dangerous. It's causing too many adverse health impacts. Get a handle on it. So they tried. And by 2025, they will have spent $3.6 billion to try and mitigate some of the impacts of the exposed lake bed. And I like this picture because it shows all of the different dikes and impoundments and these are all the different ways that they decided or that they tried to mitigate dust, the different kind of dust. You know what they found was the best thing to mitigate the dust in Owens Lake was to keep water in the lake. So lesson learned. But while they're learning this lesson, they're realizing how expensive it is to maintain these dust efforts. They tried everything from like planting plants, throwing down gravel, putting sheet flowing a little bit with some plastic balls to avoid evaporation. There's been talk also of like solar panels where they're putting those down to keep the dust down and then also generate electricity. I get more crazy ideas every day nowadays to my office, but anyway, so the point of the increased costs and how this could be a direct impact to a direct hit to Utahns if we start to see impacts to our water bill from mitigation efforts like they're seeing in LA, where it was 1/5 of their water bill. But again, the most remarkable thing I think about Owens Lake, well, two things, is that Owens Lake is 1/15 the size of Great Salt Lake. So if you look at the cost here and what they were trying to do, you see how little it is compared to Great Salt Lake. And the other thing is that Owens Lake is adjacent to a town that was probably about a couple thousand people. Here along the Wasatch Front, we have about 2 million, a little more including the Wasatch back. So I think while there are similarities, there are differences that are also quite alarming. We are looking at dust studies on Great Salt Lake. I know it's getting a ton of attention. We started in 2017 when the Division of Facilities Management said, we're interested in putting a prison on the shores of the Great Salt Lake. Is there anything we should know? Is there anything we should be concerned about? For putting prisoners out there and employees, what should we be concerned about? And this became clear that the lake levels were receding, and we're like, well, maybe we should think about dust. And so they started studying dust in 2017. The University of Utah professors went out on their bikes collecting dust samples. This map you see here are the hot spots for the dust in there as they traveled around about 800 miles around the lake bed. The important thing to know about the Great Salt Lake is there are very varying levels of crust. So in some areas where it's super salty, kind of like the Bonneville salt flats, right, that keeps the dust down, we like those layers of salt. But over time, the wind and the erosion, or the wind and the rain could erode the crust, and so we're all about not busting the crust on Great Salt Lake. And I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. But anyway, I know that people have heard a lot of scary things about arsenic and how, this is the environmental nuclear bomb of the state of Utah. And I think it is important to note that there are elements in Great Salt Lake like arsenic, and there's cadmium and lithium and all sorts of minerals and elements that you would find in a terminal lake. We don't know what the threshold is for an unacceptable level of arsenic exposure in Great Salt Lake, but the researchers are saying it's not that one particular element that is of primary concern. It's the particulates, right? So it's the PM10 and 2.5. It's these dust events overall that are problematic. It's not necessarily one element where you would need like repeated exposure for long periods of time. So again, PM10, PM2.5, as the lake bed increases, I think that's one of the things that we're needing to get a handle on. So with all this doom and gloom and sadness about scariness about Great Salt Lake, I am optimistic, and I do think that with our previous year of Great Salt Lake, there is just a dramatic shift in how people are thinking about the lake. It's no longer water that gets to Great Salt Lake is wasted water. People understand the importance of the lake and that we need it here to be a healthy, thriving municipality, a city, if we want to have millions of people living around this lake bed, it needs to have water in it. So won't go into this, but this is just kind of the foundation. There are two documents that have been driving the year of Great Salt Lake and where all the funding has been being put to save Great Salt Lake. Many brilliant water policy minds got together to help create this 12 water strategies for Great Salt Lake and at HCR 10 strategic opportunities paper, or these two publications came out in the height of COVID while we were all locked in our houses. We put together these super informative documents which have then shaped some of the law that you see coming out now with the legislature. So I'm not going to go into all of these. I just want to touch on really two. One is the in-stream flow bill. So this allows the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, my division, to hold water rights for the purposes of Great Salt Lake. Again, further illustrating the point that water to the lake isn't wasted water. It has a beneficial use just by being there in the lake bed. And then we talked about all these different means to improve municipalities and how we can do incentives to, to better incentivize developers and builders to do efficient things with their in their communities. Well, the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Program puts $40 million into Great Salt Lake to enhance its community. So we're looking at putting $30 million towards a water trust and then $10 million towards habitat restoration programs. And then a couple other things, just integrated water assessment. We're increasing staffing to help with water right transactions, and additional water bird studies on Gunnison Island. Again, a lot of these have already been mentioned. Agricultural water optimization, and I think this is important to note that we're just getting started on some of these things, especially agricultural optimization. I think people have heard, they've seen the demand, the interest, the need for agricultural water optimization and secondary water metering, and I don't think that those funding for those projects are going to be going away anytime soon. And then these are just a couple of the different funding opportunities that have been a direct benefit to my division. But the one I want to highlight is, well, two, I guess, the Sovereign Lands Trespassing Amendment. So it is illegal to travel on Great Salt Lake lake bed, and it has always been, but we're just trying to make that people more aware of that so they're not out there doing donuts, busting the crust, and joyriding out on the lake, getting stuck. So we now have one law enforcement officer dedicated to Great Salt Lake, which is, 1,700 square miles, but still, it's something. And then the last one project I wanted to highlight was the causeway breach modification and the marina dredging at Saltaire. So super interesting. You all know that there is a causeway, right, that bisects the Great Salt Lake. There's a north arm and a south arm. Well, you see the super pink water in the north arm. It's really salty. Nothing, not much lives there. The brine shrimp all hang out in the south arm. And the railroad causeway, there were two culverts in the railroad causeway that collapsed several years ago. So they were filled and this new bridge was put in. And they put it in this, this adaptive feature that would allow for modification in times of struggle. And I didn't even think in 2017 that we would be entertaining this so soon, but now here we are. The salinity levels in the south arm are so high that the brine shrimp populations are being threatened, at least the reproduction of the brine shrimp, and the cyst viability is in question, and so they like to see the brine shrimp salinity of around 12 to 16%, and we're now nearing 18%. So the problem is there's not enough fresh water getting into the south arm of the Great Salt Lake, and the north arm is super salty. So the north arm water is coming into the causeway, or coming in to the breach, at and it's super heavy, so it kind of slips under the less heavy south arm water, so like this. But in order to slow the flow of the super salty north arm water, we filled the rock causeway with rock. Really, it's not that exciting, but it was an adaptive tool that we could use to stop the flow of south arm water to try and slow the impact from the increasing salinity in the south arm. And we're hoping for a better, wetter year where we have more inflows to the south arm of the lake to bring those salinity levels down so the brine shrimp can keep reproducing. So I just wanted to highlight this as one super cool project that is happening right now. We are taking measures to ensure the sustainability of Great Salt Lake. The other one that we're working on is to dredge the marina at Great Salt Lake State Park because, as you know, the lake is adjacent to an airport, an international airport, and there are often search and rescue efforts that need to happen because plane crashes occur on the lake, and at this point we can't get out any vessels out of the marina to assist in the rescue. So working on improving access there and so we can help in any rescues as needed. With that, I'll wrap up. Thanks.
Thank you. And on top of that sobering news, my name is Rob Patterson, and I'm talking about why Oakley City can't allow any more connections to its water system. I'm a land use attorney. Oakley City, for those you don't know, out in Summit County, out east past Park City and Hideout, beautiful area. As COVID was progressing, they came to me because the drought continued and they continued to not have water in their system. And they asked me as their attorney what they could do about that. And I said, I don't really know. I'm not an engineer. I don't know how to deal with water and how you get it out into your system. But here's some legal principles, what you can do about building. As Jodi introduced this, talked about Oakley City has put a moratorium or a ban on development. And that's almost true. What Oakley actually did was not prohibit development per se. What Oakley did was say, we can't allow any more connections to our water system. If you have existing connections, that's fine. If you've already submitted and we've planned for that, that's fine. But if we allow more connections, we're losing the pressure and capacity in our system to serve our existing residents. It's not we want to stop development. It is, we don't have the ability to serve development. Oakley is somewhat famous for its water. It actually has a bottling facility out there that has now actually shut down. Its contract has been terminated. It has one well, and it got some funding a few years ago. They were very excited. They built a new tank. They were excited about this new capacity. It's not enough to serve what they currently have. As the drought conditions continue through 21 and 22, their engineers came to them and they basically wrote a report saying, your production is at capacity. You have no more room for any more production in your system. The council had a discussion with their engineers and asked, okay, what's the wiggle room? Can we allow one more connection, 2 connections? And the engineer said, no, you don't have capacity. During the peak demand season during the summer, they were worried that if there was any kind of failure in any part of the system, we're looking at a catastrophic failure of their entire system, dealing with culinary water and fire protection. And of course, with a drought, it's not just water, drinking water, it's the fact that everything dries up around you. So if anyone lights off fireworks or anything else, and suddenly we're dealing with homes that are threatened by fire, so they don't have water to suppress. And there's Oakley is a mix of very rural farmer, ranch type places, and also kind of second home, very nice homes with sprinklers that ideally would have sprinkler systems and fire suppression that Oakley can't keep up with, or is essentially at capacity. So Oakley has adopted several water conservation measurements. Like many cities, they have limitations how you can use water in your irrigating of lawns and water features. Over the years, those have gone more and more stringent, and the penalties for violating them has continued to increase to what they can. As the engineers even stated, this is only, stopping new connections is only one part of the city's overall water management plan. They were trying to conserve water in all aspects of city use. So they came to me and asked, how do we limit development until it is safe to continue development? That was their concern. I've heard from other cities, Oakley City, we've read a New York Times article, Oakley City stopped development. How do we do that in our city? I said, you don't want to be in Oakley City's position. You don't want to have to tell a developer, it's not Oakley telling the developers, we don't want you here, it's, we don't know how to serve you. And if you could drill a well on your property, Oakley allows that. Any type of connection or building that doesn't need the city system, they have allowed. They've tried to figure out ways to continue to serve residents and new residents to the extent they can without negatively impacting those residents that live there now. The city began actively pursuing funding for a new well. I don't know if any of you who work with municipalities or developers have tried to do wells. They're not cheap. They've since secured funding from USDA, Rural Development. They're trying to dig, I believe it's a 1,500-foot well, and they're very hopeful that there's going to be water at the bottom of it. And if there's not, we're not sure what we're going to do about it. In terms of what they asked me, they said, okay, we know we can do some kind of moratorium. That's what we want to do. So I said, all right, the standard moratorium under Utah law, you get a 6-month temporary moratorium. Your temporary land use regulation, people are pretty familiar with those. They put that in place. That was in, April of 2021. 6 months came and went. They don't have a system. They don't have funding for a new well. They don't have wells, bids out. Nothing has changed. They said, can we extend it? How do we extend this beyond a 6-month temporary regulation? I said, well, you're kind of treading on some uncertain and unfamiliar territory. It's pretty clear 6 months is good. Beyond that, cities exist to serve residents. Cities exist to provide municipal services. Culinary water is a municipal service. You are dealing with some very fundamental issues, and you're trying to say, we're not going to provide that service to anyone else. So after doing some research, looking into it, they've adopted a continuation, and based on two kind of factors. One is under the Land Use Development Management Act, the compelling countervailing public interest doctrine, where if you submit a land use application, generally you're entitled to approval and processing and all of that, unless we do a code amendment, not applicable. But the other exception to that is if the land use authority finds a compelling countervailing public interest that's going to be jeopardized by that application. There's not a lot of case law out there on what constitutes a compelling countervailing public interest. I said, well, not having water seems like a pretty good one. We'll see. We'll see how that goes. And then they also relied on the general powers as a water supplier to basically say, we are at capacity in terms of our, a little bit away from the municipal hat of more of the being a water service provider, culinary provider. We can't issue, will serve letters to a development. We don't have that capacity. So we're kind of saying, as part of that, our powers under that regulation, we're going to say we also can't serve anyone else. So that's the approach that Oakley has taken. So far, actually, everyone up there has been very understanding of it. It's a smaller community. It is a city, technically. But it is a smaller community. They all understand how important water is and just how little there is out there. They also understand, I think, the major component is that the city is actively working to fix this situation as best it can. It has secured funding. It's actually opening a bid for its project November. Hopefully they'll start drilling next year, and then hopefully we'll have all of the pumping and other facilities necessary by 2024 is their goal. Ideally as soon as possible, but they're going as quickly as they can there. So that's Oakley City, and it's tough. And a lot of cities, I know a lot of cities have talked about being in similar situations. I haven't seen a city yet at that level. Oakley is where their engineers are saying, you are maxing out constantly. Other cities I don't see are out there, and I hope other cities are not quite at that point. And I would encourage those cities that are to look at trying to get financing to fix that problem as soon as possible. Again, it's not a ban on development, it's a ban on being able to connect to our system, because anytime you connect, our water pressure drops and we're not gonna have fire flows. We're not gonna have, people are gonna turn on taps and water isn't gonna come out. So that's what Oakley's dealing with, and a little bit of how we got to where we are.
Hi, my name's Joanna Endter-Wada, and as said before, I'm a faculty member at Utah State University. And I'm here today, though, in my capacity as a member of a team that is implementing integrating land and water planning in Utah. And it's called the Utah Growing Water Smart Program. The legislature a couple years ago provided some funding for this, and so I'm here to update you and to tell you about some opportunities to try to integrate land and water planning. This is not just an issue for us. I want to mention that national organizations are dealing with the issue of integrating land and water because of the consequences that we're seeing everywhere from climate change. We've seen the hurricanes just taking out half of Florida, and we've seen the damage in Houston several years ago, the property damage and the costs from not planning and having development go in areas that are not as secure and that are risky. Out here, we have the problem we're discussing today of developing where we don't have enough water to supply. So, our team consists of the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy, Western Resource Advocates, and I am with the Center for Water Efficient Landscaping at Utah State University. So I just want to introduce the team, tell you what we have, tell you about workshops, and the first one's going to be pretty soon. So Western Resource Advocates has been involved with the Growing Water Smart program in Arizona and Colorado. And they have a lot of resources that they have developed, curriculum materials, guides, ordinances, examples of things from around the West. And so they are a real strategic partner in helping bring this program to Utah. The Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy is a Western extension of the Lincoln Land Institute, or the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy, that celebrated its 75th year this year, and they're located in Cambridge. They're the Western extension of this, and they have a big portfolio of resources for land policy, but here we're integrating water with it, or they are, and they have a lot of focus areas on research and partnership. They have funded Growing Water Smart in Colorado, Arizona, and they are bringing a lot of matching funding to Utah. So the legislative money that's funding this effort provides only about half of it. Between Utah State University Extension and the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy, we were able to double the amount of resources through contributions to help make the program even more robust. And Center for Water Efficient Landscaping, hopefully you know about us. We conduct the Water Check program, the Water Maps program, have large portfolio of what research that we do with landscape plant materials, and with the human behavior related to plants, irrigation technologies, people behavior, and trying to water more efficiently in an urban environment. Division of Water Resources oversees this program, and so there are people in the Division of Water Resources, Laura with the Division of Forestry, Fire, State Lands. Audubon has been very helpful in a lot of programming related to the Great Salt Lake, which is a driver right now, as you've heard, of why we're doing this. And so I just wanted to mention them. They are working with us also. and overseeing the project that our team is developing. So why care about it? I mentioned why care about it. We've talked all this afternoon about why care about it. But Utah, when you look at the map, we're split. Right down the middle, north to south, pretty much a little bit of a diagonal there between the Colorado River Basin and the Great Basin. Both are in drought. If we think we're going to go somewhere else for more water, it's looking a little doubtful. There are pictures in the news these days of major rivers in the Midwest. Think of headwaters of the Mississippi and the Missouri River that are dry, stretches of big rivers. So, we're all in this together, not only in Utah, but nationally, this is a very big issue. And so we care about it for a lot of different reasons, but here we care about it because we share the Colorado River and the Great Salt Lake and the issues that we've been talking about. So the integrated land use and water planning was showed in an earlier slide. It's one of the 4 cornerstones of water conservation measures that we're implementing here in Utah. And we, just a couple other points about why we should integrate it is historically, these 2 areas have been siloed. They're siloed in a lot of different ways. They're siloed in universities, they're siloed in planning, they're siloed in state does the water and local governments do the land planning. And so it's bringing those together for reasons to create greater resiliency, to talk, so that when development is occurring in St. George, they don't go to Zach and Zach has to tell them you didn't do your due diligence. The planning is to get together early so that those kinds of situations don't arise and you aren't planning for developments in areas that can't support it with the water. So there are a lot of connection points for how this integration can occur. We're building curriculum, examples from our state, from other states, about where you can make the connections in integrating land and water planning, and that's part of what this program is doing and the workshops will be doing. I just wanted to bring this to your attention that there's lots of points of connection where it can occur that it just hasn't, and we haven't thought about it, but we have to be thinking about those connection points. A lot of different tools there. Here's examples of some of the land water integration resources that we'll be integrating into the workshops, and the guidebook that we'll create for Utah will be available to people across the state and publicly available. We have a small brochure on the Growing Water Smart in Utah, and right now in this whole program, we're in this phase where we're initiating the workshops. Our first one is November 15th to 17th. We had 6 different entities all along the Wasatch Front that applied to be part of the workshop and to participate. They were, accepted in terms of their applications and their readiness. 2 counties, 4 cities, all in the Great Salt Lake Basin, covering a large amount of territory. And so we're anxious to have such a good group participating this very first time. So, Growing Water Smart workshops, what do? A team comes from a community. It's people from the land side, people from the water side, community development people, and they come as a team and they get 3 days in this workshop, all expenses paid, it's covered through the project, to sit down and work together on how they're going to integrate, do an ordinance, do a plan, do an activity that they have in front of them. And they have some presentations, but most of the 3 days is guided, facilitated sessions where they are working together to figure out how they're going to end up with an action plan, but to identify their problems, how they're going to go about working on it. And they are just fascinating discussions that they have when they're outside the general workday that's so busy. They're able to really have great conversations, move forward, they walk out with an action plan of what they're going to do next. So these are the kinds of people that are involved who should attend, and the teams are usually about 7 to 10 people. The format is setting an intention for what they're going to do, having roundtables related to issues that they're guided through, and then finalizing an action plan and messaging. There are a lot of materials that are provided aside from the guidebook, lots of videos, lots of resources from a lot of different states in a headquarters place online. They're all available to the participants and helpful materials. So these are the kinds of things that communities can expect to get out of the workshops: insights and strategies and tools and communications and ways to collaborate, action plan, and then a continuing peer-to-peer networking with growing water smart communities. So there are also technical resources that follow up after the workshop. There are a number of ways that they can apply for grants and funding, both through the project and through other nonprofit organizations that are working in this space to help communities integrate land and water planning. So our first workshop is going to be at Wheeler Farm coming up in a couple of weeks, but then we will have another workshop in the spring, and hopefully they will continue. So we're in this second phase of getting them up and going, and we are continuing to look for funding then to extend them on out, and the legislature is anxious to see what comes of this. So we'll be accepting more applications in the spring. growingwatersmartutah.org. Keep your eyes out for that. And I have a couple of pieces of information for you, but we can talk more if any of you are interested about that application process. And I'm going to be here for the next 2 days, or I mean today and tomorrow, and both of the 2 days. And so if there's anything that you want to talk about, want some more information, there is a policy brief. I brought some copies of this, of something that the Lincoln Institute produced called Integrating Land Use and Water Management into General Plans. There's a resource guide for that. And that is something you can download off a website today. And so we want to make these resources available to all of you. We're in it together, and scaling this up and addressing this problem at a state level is empowering communities to work with each other, to work together, so that we can all sort of tackle these daunting challenges that we have right now. So look forward to working with you. Thanks.
Okay, one quick point before we go to audience questions. You should be writing down your questions as I'm talking. All of the conference materials that you've seen presented today and you'll see presented tomorrow are available or will be available to you at www.utahlanduse.org. There's also a QR code in your materials so you can go directly to the website. So, we're getting close to the end of the day, but I know I've got your attention. Are there folks out in the audience that have questions for any of our panelists? Just hang out for the mic.
I know this is on everyone's mind, but I'll go ahead and ask the question because it was in the paper, but what about the pipeline from the Pacific Ocean to the Great Salt Lake? This is my favorite topic.
We'll let Laura answer that one.
Oh, it's mine too, really. It makes my heart beat a little faster when people bring it up because I just think, I can't imagine the time and money that it would take to bring that to fruition. Would be, the lake could be dry by then, right? Like, so it could be decades before anything like that could be even feasible. We just had the Division of Water Resources. The Division of Water Resources just did a quick back of the envelope calculation to see what the costs of that alone would be, and it was about $60 to $100 billion just for the infrastructure for it. That didn't include the NEPA, that didn't include the, the years of back and forth trying to get the projects implemented across interstate lines. So this endeavor was just recently, I guess, shot down or tabled with the Salton Sea, and that's in California. So the Salton Sea, they are trying to pull water from the Pacific up to keep their lake bed wet, and they kind of gave it the thumbs down because of just simply the costs and the mechanics of it all. It just wasn't feasible, and I think we need to focus on what are the tools that we have locally in our toolbox to make things happen on a much quicker fashion. I don't know how many, we don't have decades to solve the problem. We've got years, and so we can't even look at that as an option.
Yes.
Just to follow up to that question, interim last week in committee, there was a discussion about going down rather than going up.
In interim session last week, I believe there was discussion on drilling down, and the number 10,000 feet sticks in my mind. Any veracity to that possibility versus bringing it in from the west?
Well, at least we're looking more local, right? But still, I mean, the feasibility of bringing nuclear reactors here to draw up water to pump to the lake when, like you're saying in Oakley, there's an unknown amount of water. We can't put our eggs in that basket of, drilling down thousands of feet and hoping for the best. It's another thing that's just not feasible or timely. I don't think it will have legs, maybe more so than the pipeline, but definitely.
They've done that in the Central Valley, and you know how they've had those huge subsidence issues from just lack of the support from the aquifer. Other questions? Brent, way up there, or well, how about right? Yeah, sorry, Craig.
Thanks. I don't mean to oversimplify this problem, and I'm not making a suggestion, but how far down the road would we get towards solving this problem if, like, the legislature were to just outlaw residential grass?
How many people would get voted out of office if they did that? I don't know.
Shawn?
Well,
Laura?
I'll just say one quick thing. I mean, you saw from the graph of the depletion, the impact of municipal industrial is pretty slight in comparison to other uses, so maybe we look at other uses as well.
And I would add to that even in the short time that we've gone from typically just having water rights bills to having this bunch of bills every session dealing with water, I've seen cities make a lot of progress, their residents make a lot of progress on opening their minds to reducing the amount of grass. And I think this legislation, again, that we passed last year was a step in that direction. So I really think if we continue to have this drought and experience the growth that we have and the need to provide housing for people, that our population is going to come along. I just see that happening.
Joanna?
I'm going to add something here. My colleague Kelly Cope, who's working on this too with the Center for Water Efficient Landscaping, is a turf grass expert. And up at the Greenville Farm at Utah State University, we do a lot of research as part of national trials on how different types of grasses respond to drought, if they're salt tolerant, if they are drought tolerant. And so I'm speaking up on her behalf. She would weigh in now on a total vilification of grass without the nuance of the fact that there are many different types of grass. And there are cultivars that they work with, that my colleagues work with, that use 25% of what Kentucky bluegrass uses is, and golf courses are moving in this direction where they are using different kinds of turf in different parts depending on its level of play. So turf is important to deal with, how we water it, but I'll tell you that I deal with the Water Maps program that was the basis for some of the success that they saw with secondary metering in Weber Basin. And it's showing people how much they're using compared to how much they need using a landscape budgeting approach. Even with existing landscapes, even without removing turf or changing the landscape, we have about 50% of the use that we could save. It's not being used to meet plant need. It's being applied in excess of what the plants actually need. So there are a lot of ways that we can work with the existing, because taking out everybody's landscape at this point in time and replacing that is a heavy lift and might not be feasible, but people can still do something to be as efficient as possible with what they're using. The new development is just extremely important. I want to say what Bart mentioned. We have been on properties where we're looking at irrigation systems, doing water checks, that the system itself isn't very efficient in how to, in applying the water. These systems sometimes are 50 years old, and you can't even get the parts to repair them. Those are kind of extreme examples. But it's when you put something in, when you pay a lot of money for a landscape, if you haven't applied all the principles of a good water-wise landscape in terms of soil treatment and plant and design and the irrigation system in particular, you are locking in a particular type of use for a long period of time that no good habit on the part of the person wanting to conserve can overcome. You have to have the right kind of plant material on slopes that, So anyway, I'll just say that there's a lot that we have learned about how to deal with the landscapes. And we work with the people who are also doing the ag optimization. So anyway, had to step in here on Kelly's behalf.
I'll step in too. Just one. Okay, go ahead, Wilf. Go ahead.
So given what Rob just described with Oakley City, and I've been hearing a little bit of the sentiment around, and I guess I particularly am asking Rob and Shawn and Jodi maybe, but all of you, what if a community just decides and says, we don't really want to grow anymore, and we're about tapped out on water, so that's it, and we're not going to develop any more water, and we're just going to be done with development. Is that even feasible? Is that something that can happen?
So,
I will say that as he was speaking, that's exactly what I was thinking and I'm sure there were some in the development community that were thinking that exact same thing. Could it happen? It could, right? I mean, how would we define legally? Would we have to say they're pursuing it with reasonable diligence, and what would that mean to develop the water supply? That's been the problem with trying to come up with, I know we're not supposed to use the M word, moratorium, but that's the problem with coming up with a moratorium statute for water, is how do we address those issues where that might come up? I'm not saying, obviously, clearly that's not what's happening in Oakley, but there is a concern. I think it's a valid one.
You want to go, Rob, or you want me to go?
Go.
So one of the things that I've got just sticking in my craw from a long time ago and now is, if you looked at Laura's maps to see the water supply and the water demand from various sources, the water demand for municipal entities, for M&I use, has stayed flat for 20 years, 30 years, the entire time I've been in Utah. Yet our population's doubled, right? You know what's also 50 years old is the State Division of Water Quality's standards for municipal water systems. 0.45 acre feet per home, for culinary use, for indoor use, for every single house. It's ridiculous when the actual use is in the .2s. So now what happens? All of these people have paid, for everybody that's paid impact fees, they've paid for almost a half an acre foot of water for each house. Now we're not going to give them to them. Now we're going to say, no, you have to have that low flow toilet, you have to have that low flow shower head, you can't water outside, you can't do this. Who compensates them for that? They've paid for that. They've paid into a trust account to have that water available. Now what happens? Now I don't think that's probably true of the property tax supported conservancy districts. They don't tend to do water impact fees. The municipalities do. But to me, that's the glaring problem, is these people have paid to have that amount of water, and they're not getting it. It's clear they're not getting it. They're getting half.
And Jodi, I'd like to clarify and just say, I don't think there are going to be a lot of cities that would do that, or towns, but there might be a few that like their exclusivity that might do it. But overall, I would say it's just something we would have to address if we were to tackle that in statute. It'd be very difficult to do. But I think the last issue on sizing, and this is something, and Mark, I don't know if I weighed out there or not, but we've been discussing internally as cities with the development community on what can we do, because we do think we have an antiquated standard right now, and everybody's afraid to violate it because they're afraid of the legal exposure, and if they run short on water. There is a way, a mechanism now at least, that you can go in with data to get your sizing requirements reduced. That's a lot of work for a lot of cities to do that are already stretched, trying to just keep up with the pace of growth. But if we could come up with some standards, or an easy way to reduce the standards, that would reduce impact fees, but also reduce our overall cost as cities of maintaining an infrastructure that is bigger than what we need.
I think that's important.
If I could add on, sorry.
You bet.
I looked at several, I tried to find any case in Utah when I was looking at Oakley's water restrictions, and what case is there in Utah that deals with this, and there's not many. There's a very old mandamus case from, maybe I shouldn't say very old, Royalty Plymouth Town, and it talked about, someone tried to ask the Utah Supreme Court to say, this town needs to extend a water line to serve me because I live in this town. I'm entitled to water because of that. The Utah Supreme Court said, if that was right, the consequence is that the town board, acting for the town, was legally bound to supply water to all inhabitants, no matter how ruinous and destructive the result may be. The unsoundness of this contention is easily demonstrable. So there is some precedent of, at some point, there's two interests of, new residents, new property owners who want to build new things and connect, have a certain expectation and a right to connect to a municipal water supply if they're within municipal boundaries. Existing residents who have existing connections and have had existing connections for a long time also have the right that their water supply is not going to be damaged by new growth. And so at some point, a city might be sued by both parties and saying, you are hurting me, and you're also hurting me by doing what you're doing.
So I just wanted to follow up on kind of Will's statement with a slightly different question. Whether Oakley has or has considered some kind of adequate public facilities ordinance, that rather than the moratorium that says, because you get all the news because it's like, oh, you're stopping growth. So the adequate public facilities ordinance says, in order to submit your application, you are required to bring the water. Maybe they already have one because you're smiling about it. But the second half of that question would be, if you have an adequate public facilities ordinance and somebody comes up and says, I have the ability to drill the well, I'm willing to spend the money, you just need to put it in your system. At that point, you think they could get some kind of mandamus that you had to accept it.
I'll say on the second part of that question, the city actually there's been a couple of residents who said, I have my own separate water supply that I have. And the city says, fine, you're not impacting our water system, absolutely go ahead and build. We're not restricting you. That's why I was trying to clarify, the ban isn't specifically on development, it's development that impacts the existing water supply. As to the adequate facilities, yes, they have something, kind of. They could obviously beef it up. It's one of those things of, they do require, as many towns do, water dedication and providing water supplies. It's trying to figure out how to make that work with the existing system. That's the problem.
Yeah, many jurisdictions have concurrency requirements for their infrastructure, especially on the Wasatch back, even on the Wasatch front, and that's how they would solve that nut. But I don't think any jurisdiction is trying to figure out how to get out of supplying water. This is a real problem, And as these systems age, they become less efficient. I mean, yeah, you can have the water right, but if your well isn't pumping that quantity of water, that's the only thing that really matters. So I'm not really sure what the answer is. Craig, I think we've hit our stop time.
So I'll be darned, it's exactly right on time. Thank you for this panel. And thanks to you. The slides, the PowerPoints will be on our website as soon as we can get them up. And if you are a realtor, you must pick up your certificate now. Thanks. Hope to see most of you in the morning.